So, yes, this is Dave's article on beliefs, language, and logic.
Okay. Logic is an important part of rationality. After all, acting rationally is acting in accordance with reason and according to the rules of logic, among other things. Which means that understanding the rules of logic are important if one wants to claim rationality for oneself. There is more to logic than simply the rules, though. As William Hodges says in his book Logic, logic is also about consistency with regards to our beliefs. Another important part of logic is its link to language and how we use language. The sloppier our language, the more likely we are to have errors creep into our thinking and our beliefs, and the more likely our sets of beliefs are inconsistent. So understanding language and its link to logic, and understanding the link they both have to beliefs, will help us to think more clearly and help us to have more consistent sets of beliefs. It will essentially help us to be more logical. It will also help with understanding other people's arguments, as well as assessing and breaking down those arguments in a more logical manner. We will begin with a discussion about what beliefs are. So what do we mean by belief?
And just whilst you scroll down, I'd like to say, hey, Opie, and everyone else who's tuned in right now, drop us a line in the chat.
Hey, Opie. Within the contemporary atheist and skeptic community, at least on places like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding about what a belief actually is. Many seem to define it as something like accepting something is true without any evidence, as you mentioned earlier, often attempting to define it in such a way that it relates only to religious people, with some attempting to define it in a wholly derogatory way, with many even going as far as claiming they hold no beliefs or only accept knowledge, claiming that they avoid beliefs because they only accept things with evidence. Those that argue like this show a clear misunderstanding of what a belief actually is. We all hold beliefs, and even when we have knowledge of something, we still hold a belief about it. Belief is a necessary component of knowledge. Belief is not sufficient for knowledge, but it is necessary. What then is a belief?
Yeah, I mean, we can draw a line there, can't we, Dave, where we say there are many people out there that will say, I don't have beliefs, I only know things, or I don't believe them.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure you believe that.
Yep. And that's one of the things where it's sort of evidence that having clear and precise definitions and using words correctly and in consistent ways can stop or not doing it like that can allow bad thinking to creep in or can allow us to have better thinking. Because if you hold a thing like beliefs are just when you accept something true without evidence, then you erase a whole part of your own psychological state. And you come across problems like, I only accept knowledge. Well, what is knowledge? Knowledge is things that you know. Okay.
And then you get down that whole path of knowledge versus information as well.
Yeah.
Which actually probably ties in quite well to what you're discussing this week. And maybe we should discuss knowledge versus information next week.
Yeah, sounds good. Because you've got that really good article about it. So we could do that as a reading next week.
Sounds good to me. I wouldn't say it was really good, but it does the trick.
Ooh, sorry. I've just finished eating, so I'm a bit gassy. I promise to switch the microphone off when I do, though. Honest.
It adds to the humor, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when we are discussing beliefs, what we are talking about is our responses to propositions. There are those here that will argue that a belief is a psychological state, not a response to a proposition. They would be correct too, of course, as a belief is a psychological state. However, We do not have access to the psychological states of others, nor can we give access to our psychological states. We can only report on those psychological states. So when we discuss beliefs, we can only discuss expressions of belief, meaning that we can only discuss propositions and our responses to those propositions. So what do we mean by a proposition? A proposition is a I seem to have forgotten an is. A proposition is a declarative statement about the nature of the world. It is a claim that some state of affairs obtains in reality. In other words, it's a statement that asserts that such and such is the case. I mean, this is a real simplification of it, but so the statement God exists is a proposition. It's a statement that asserts that there is an existent being in reality that we label as God. The opposite proposition would be God does not exist, which asserts that the aforementioned proposition is not true. There is no existent being that we call God in reality. A simple rule of thumb to determine whether or not a statement is a proposition is to replace the P in is it true that P with the proposition in question. So if P equals God exists, we would be left with the question, is it true that God exists? So if after replacing the P in is it true that P with whatever statement we have leaves us with a grammatically correct question, then we can consider that the statement is a proposition.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that it comes through there. But just in case it wasn't clear, a proposition, at least in this regard, tends to be something that is also binary. It's something that is true or false. So if I was to say it's raining outside, obviously there's context of me talking about outside my window, not outside your window. But if I was talking about it raining outside right now, it would either be true or false that it is raining outside. Now, I'm not talking about the type of rain. You could say, oh, pitter patter, it doesn't really count as full rain. I mean, that's making it too complex. It's still raining, it's just a type of rain. You could think about a light switch. A light switch is on or off. If you've got a dimmer switch, it's still on at various brightnesses. And you could consider that as almost like a strength of your belief in whether it's on or off. But at the end of the day, that switch, whether it's got a dimmer switch or not, is still either on or off, true or false. And that when you're talking about a proposition, and when you're looking at things through propositional logic, that is one of the things that remains true about it. It is true or false.
Yeah, and generally, a proposition has propositional content that's transferable. So, like you said, when you say it's raining outside, the content of that is, for me, Joe, I am sat here and outside of my window or outside of my house, there is rain coming down. So when you transfer that from statement to statement, it still remains the same content.
Yeah, I actually had someone misrepresent that as an example of a proposition the other day, and they went, "Yeah, well, it could be raining elsewhere." And I was like, "Yeah, but I'm talking about me and outside of my window. I'm not talking about it raining somewhere around the world. I mean, we could have a proposition that it is always raining somewhere in the world or somewhere in the universe, but we're not talking about that. There is a bit of context to the belief, or to the proposition, should I say? Sorry." So when we're talking about God exists, we're talking the same sort of thing. We're talking about anywhere in the world. Now you could talk about specific gods, obviously, but it depends on whether you're talking local or global with the God claim there. And it depends on what you regard as a god. There is always that sort of context, and that's why you might have someone talking about local atheism, for example, or local theism, rather than global.
Yeah, and it's why the content of the proposition is important, because when you use the term God, you're generally speaking of a particular thing. You're speaking of an all-powerful being, and timeless, spaceless. The word God, capital G, has different content to the word God, lowercase g. So when you say which God are you talking about, you're usually using a lowercase g, And you're referring to, well, which one of these gods around the world? The Hindu wouldn't normally use the term God. They would use the term Brahma or Vishnu.
They'd probably speak about the specific god, or they might be talking in a pluralistic sense, the gods.
Yeah. And in the West, the term God usually refers to a particular type of God. That is the timeless, spaceless,
Yeah.
know.
The capital G is
Formless.
generally that Abrahamic god, isn't it?
Yeah, or something very close. I suppose you could say, well, what about the pantheist? They refer to God as the universe as God, but that would be a different proposition, and it would have different propositional content, and that would come, like you were saying about the guy saying, well, it could be raining elsewhere. You would get that context of what they mean by God from who they are.
Yeah. If you're speaking to a Christian and they say God exists, and you go, well, which one? It's a bit of a ridiculous statement because you've got the context of them being a Christian. And equally, if I go, it's raining outside or it's not raining outside, again, we've got the content of me talking. So I'm not talking about where they are, but people like to be a bit, what's the word? Oh, it slipped my mind.
Argumentative.
Well, no, they definitely like to be argumentative, but that's not the word I'm looking for right now. They like to obfuscate the problem. But there's a particular word I'm looking for that I can't think of. But either way,
Combative.
no, again, no, they're basically trying to hide the problem and like hide the ball sort of thing. They're
You were right when you said obfuscate.
oh, okay. Well, there you go. I couldn't remember the word that I said.
Yeah, they're trying to muddy the water.
Yes. That was the simplistic term that I was looking for.
Yeah, obfuscate.
Yeah.
So you had it right.
Excellent. I try and use simplistic language though, and I couldn't think of how to describe it. But yeah, I think people try, and rather than take a point that, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about this, they try and hide the fact that they didn't know this by trying to go and move the goalposts and muddy the water with what we're talking about. I've had it happen a few times. For example, when people talk about you can't prove a negative, and I talk about a number of different negatives that you can actually prove. And then you go, mathematical negatives is an obvious one. Logical things that just don't make sense, like a square circle. You can obviously say, right, well, I can prove that doesn't exist because a square circle can't exist. It's logically incoherent. And then you go, I can prove to you right now that there isn't a dragon in my living room. And they'll go, well, I think the dragon's invisible. And like, but that's not what we're
What if
talking
it's
about.
invisible? Yeah, what if it's invisible and spaceless and immaterial? And
Yeah.
usually the answer is, well, then it's not a dragon.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're taking away the definition. Oh, what if I think it's only 2 inches tall? Okay, so what's the definition of every dragon that has come to pass throughout the years? And it's just like, rather than admit that the fact that, okay, there are some negatives that you can prove, I'll admit there's a lot of metaphysical negatives that you can't prove without a doubt. You can obviously demonstrate issues with definitions of this particular thing and the characteristics, like we were talking about the other day when we justified our atheism. But there are so many people so desperate to hide certain aspects. It's just, well, it's frustrating more than anything else.
It is, and it's those kind of responses that this sort of speaks to. This article, like I say, they'll hold inconsistent things. Like you can't prove a negative. Okay, well, you can prove that there's no square circles, like you mentioned, and then they'll say, okay, well, you can't prove such and such. Okay, but you're now trying to cling on to a false belief because you have a need to be able to make a particular claim. So by holding those faulty definitions, you're allowing bad logic to creep into how you think. Does that make sense?
It does to me. Hope it makes sense to
Yeah.
everyone out there watching.
Well, it probably will, because they generally agree with us anyway. But, those catching the rerun.
And if it doesn't make sense, let us know, and we'll explain a little bit better, either in a future stream or just in the comments. So we're happy to expand on the ideas. But
okay. So the next paragraph. This is because not all statements are propositions. Some are commands. For example, go to the shop and get milk is a command, as is empty the dishwasher. They're both statements that can't be true or false, but they're grammatically correct statements. And I've seen people mistake commands for propositions. If we replace the P in "is it true that P" with one of those statements, we are not left with a grammatically correct question. If we replace P with a question, then it too fails to yield a grammatically correct question. For example, if we replace P with "does God exist," then we are left with "is it true that does God exist?" revealing an ungrammatical question. So, as stated, a simple test to see whether we are dealing with a proposition is to replace P in "is it true that P" with whatever string we are dealing with. If we are left with a grammatically correct question, then P is a proposition. Our response to this newly formed question is our attitude towards P, or our belief about P. Consider a proposition like "it will be sunny tomorrow." This proposition creates a grammatical question by replacing P in "is it true that P" with the proposition, showing us that it is a valid proposition. We are choosing this proposition because it represents several basic ideas about language and beliefs. The first basic idea is that the same string can represent several different propositions, meaning that it can represent several different beliefs. This is something like you were talking about with the "it's raining outside." If we consider the idea of this belief being stated every day for a year, well, we have uttered the exact same words each day. Each tomorrow is a different day. Each time the belief is uttered, it represents the state of the weather the day after the day it is uttered, and it therefore represents 365 different beliefs.
Yep.
So this is what I was saying about propositional content, where the content is transferable. So is it raining tomorrow? It will rain tomorrow, or it will be sunny tomorrow. They're the same statement, but the propositional content is different each day you say it, or even each area you say it in gives it different content.
Exactly. And yeah, the same sort of thing can be said. So if we're talking about "it will be sunny tomorrow," there's obviously the geographical element to that as well, because it's the geographical element of where the person is. Like I was saying, like "it's raining outside." I'm not talking about where you are. I'm talking about where I am. And it's the same thing. And tomorrow, I'm not talking about tomorrow where you are. I'm talking about tomorrow where I am. Dave and I live in different parts of the country. In fact, technically, we live in different countries. So, if Dave's talking about it raining there, that definitely doesn't mean it's raining here. In fact, I've actually lived in places where I've walked 100 meters down the road, and I've gone from it being raining through it being sunny to it raining again, and it was a really weird experience. Probably slightly longer than 100 meters, but it was a walk home from a pub I used to work at to my house, and it was really, really weird. So when you're talking about these things, as you've mentioned a number of times, there is a lot more content than what people might perceive to be, and that as your next title, "Context is important." Yes, it is.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah. I'd just like to say, hey Josiah and hey Manny, how you doing? Hope you're well.
We don't have to start again, do we? No. They can read the
No,
article.
no. Do you know what? Knowing them two, they've already read it anyway, and they're just here for the bants.
And they already probably know more than me about this stuff anyway, so.
Oh, and Manny's going to
Oh,
pop in and out. Oh, hey.
sure.
Kinky.
Okay. Yeah, so this section is about context, like you said, and going, with the heading. Another basic idea that this proposition represents is the idea that the same string can be uttered and can be true on some occasions and false on some others. It will not always be sunny tomorrow, but it will be sunny on some days. Each day, the same proposition is used, but each day it represents a different belief, and each different belief can either be true or false, which leads us to another basic idea that this proposition represents, the idea that context is important. The references that a proposition makes are an important part of the proposition, giving the proposition its context. What we are saying is influenced by when we are saying it, where we are saying it, and why we are saying it. All of these things give us a good understanding of why clarity is important when discussing propositions and beliefs, and why our language should be as exact and precise as possible. Ambiguous references in a proposition and belief can lead to errors in logic, especially when considering sets of propositions and beliefs. They can also lead to misunderstandings when communicating and discussing beliefs. So, in this instance, think of something like atheism is just a lack of belief in gods. This leads to rocks and babies being
Regarded as
atheists.
atheists. Yeah.
Yeah, and people say atheists are just being atheist is just a lack of belief in God. That's what makes you atheist. But then they'll also go on to say something like atheists, um, they reject the claim that God exists based on a lack of evidence.
And they
Well,
will
then you
also say it's a considered position. A lot of atheists say it's a considered and rational position, and that atheism, being an atheist, makes you smart and rational. Uh,
yeah,
which, I mean, this is going on your whole point of consistent beliefs, isn't it, Dave? Because all of those
yeah,
things can't all be true. It can't be an answer to a proposition at the same time as it only being a lack of belief and including everything that lacks belief, and it being a smart rational position because, well, what? Because if
yeah,
rocks
that's
are
it.
also atheists, then it's not a smart rational position. So
Or
what?
considered.
No.
Yeah, it's just describing a lack of a particular cognitive state. And, you can add stuff on top of that in certain instances and keep a consistent definition. Okay, so going back to the propositions God exists and God does not exist, we can see just how easily ambiguity can come into these propositions. Propositions that we may not even think are ambiguous. Think too of the example of it being sunny tomorrow. Just as the proposition "it will be sunny tomorrow," said several different days in a row, represents many beliefs, the proposition God exists, said by many different people, can represent many different beliefs. The proposition put forward by a pantheist means something very different to the proposition put forward by a Christian, which again means something very different when put forward by a Muslim.
Or any other religion.
Exactly. I didn't want to go on with too many examples because, let's face it, my writing is already long as it is. Although this one's reasonably short compared to many. Um, each of them represents a different belief when said by each of them. The proposition might sound the same, but each of them is saying something slightly different. What is needed to make the proposition less ambiguous is a finger pointing word. The proposition needs to be something like the Christian God exists or the Islamic God exists. However, just as in the case of the proposition, it will be sunny tomorrow, we can in fact get this from the proposition alone. We can get this information from the context of the proposition. Who said the proposition gives us indication as to which God is being spoken about in the proposition. If uttered by a Christian, then it is more than likely the Christian God being spoken about. If uttered by a pantheist, then it is most likely the pantheist definition of the God being spoken about. Of course, if we know nothing about the person uttering the phrase, then the phrase is ambiguous. If we replace it with our own definition, such as a generic creator being, then we will be speaking of a different belief to the one uttering the phrase originally. We will essentially be talking across each other. Clarity in the proposition is necessary to make sure there is clarity in the discussion. Otherwise, we may be speaking of two separate things. This is what I was saying earlier, about if a pantheist says God exists, you can get that propositional content from who's saying it.
Yes, definitely. And again, it's the thing of what people should take from it. If I'm talking about it being raining outside, I'm not talking about outside your house or outside your house. I'm talking about my house. And the same thing.
Exactly.
If you know you're speaking to a Christian, you're speaking about a Christian God. If you know you're speaking about to a Hindu, you know you're speaking to the Hindu gods. If you don't know who you're speaking to in this sense, okay, fair enough. You could say which god, but generally online, if you're speaking to someone on Twitter, they have a profile and you can click on their profile and they go, okay, they clearly have loads of crosses all over their profile and they say, I love Jesus. I think we're talking about the Abrahamic deity and they're a Christian.
Yeah. And I mean, you'll see it like channels like Capturing Christianity and Inspiring Christianity. They'll start speaking about God, and a bunch of super smart, rational, skeptic atheists will jump in and go, well, which God are you talking about? Well, it's kind of obvious from who they are which God they are talking about.
Yeah.
Sometimes the question, which God, is appropriate, but sometimes you're just being an ass.
Yeah. And to be honest, I've used it both ways myself. When I've been having a conversation with someone and I've found them awkward, I am guilty of becoming awkward myself, and I've made those sorts of statements. Manny's got a question before we carry on. He says, "So sorry to bring this up, but how does Duke talk about this differently?" I think I need a bit more context from you there, Manny. What do you
Yeah.
mean? How does Duke talk about this differently? Or are you talking about something about the threads that we were talking on earlier? I'm sorry. I'm going to let Dave carry on this section and let you fill in the blank.
Okay. Expanding the proposition into a fuller statement can help to understand the context. Oh, wait. Nope. I've skipped a paragraph,
You
haven't I?
did.
This is because the referent in the word God is a different referent. It is important to have a clear referent, and when discussing beliefs, it is important that each party involved in the conversation is using the same referent. So if this is like, if I say kick the ball, and there's 3 different balls, and I mean the one on the right, and you take it to mean the one on the left, we're having a different conversation. So it's important in cases where there could be ambiguity to make sure that we are both referring to the same thing.
Yeah. So if I was to turn around to you and say, Dave, I'm suddenly convinced a God exists, it would be fair for you to turn around and go, well, which one? Are we talking about a
Yeah.
specific God, or is it you're just talking in general, or whatever? However, if I was to say, oh my God, I've just seen Jesus, I believe a God exists, and you were to go, which one? You'd be a fucking idiot.
Yeah, you would. Because it's pretty obvious from what you've said in that kind of context, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. As stated above, if each party is using a different referent, then they are each arguing different things. Each party might be using the same words and uttering the same sentences, but they are actually making different arguments and expressing different beliefs. They are, essentially, committing a form of lexical ambiguity, where one word is used to express many different ideas and taken in completely the wrong way. As with the "it will be sunny tomorrow" proposition, context can help to clarify what the referent is. However, sometimes we forget how important context is to the words being uttered. Expanding the proposition into a fuller statement can help to understand context and help to understand the belief that is being expressed, of course. Doing so can help to understand where misrepresentations and misunderstandings are happening. Consider the proposition "it will be sunny tomorrow." That proposition can be expanded into a fuller statement such as, "I believe that it is true that it will be sunny tomorrow in my local area." If the speaker had intended it to be less localized, then the declarative statement would be something more specific, such as, "it will be sunny where you are tomorrow," or "it will be sunny in California tomorrow." If the phrase is not more specific, then it has expressed their belief incorrectly, and the lack of specificity has caused ambiguity.
Yeah, and I mean that's like what we were talking about with the whole rain example as well. When I said talking about it raining outside, and then they were so desperate to find how a belief could be both true and false, and it's like, yeah, but in the sense of it raining outside, I'm talking about outside my window right now. It can't be true and false at the same time outside my window. If we take the whole world into account, then of course it can. Leon says, people do not know how to inductively conclude what God the conversation is most likely about. I think actually they do know how to. I think they're just being
Belligerent.
disingenuous. Belligerent, yeah, that's another good word. Yeah. They're, I suppose in some respects, trying to make the point that there's tons of gods out there. Which one are you talking about? Which, okay, I get what you're doing with that sort of statement, but making that sort of statement, you're talking past the person, and it's pretty pointless, really.
Yeah. Especially if you're trying to win the argument, because then you're essentially strawmanning them.
Yep.
You're attacking. I mean, it's not exactly strawmanning because you're not attacking a weaker version in order to bring them down, but you're trying to create a really ambiguous argument that you can then go on to attack and move the conversation elsewhere.
Yeah. Which is actually what happened after that conversation I was having about the rain thing. They then switched it to things like quantum particles and things like that, and you're just like, but we're not talking about that sort of thing. We're talking about a basic proposition. I'm not talking about quantum states. I'm not talking about how light can be both a wave and a particle. I'm not, that you're being ridiculous. Yeah, absolutely ridiculous. You're talking past me. Let's have the conversation that we're having.
Yeah.
This is a glass. It is either true or false that this is a glass. This is a glass. It is also true or false that this is a glass. I could possibly use it as a glass, but it wouldn't make it a glass because it is not made of glass and it's a pill pot. And this actually is a glass.
Well, it's when they argue things as well, like atheism is just a lack of belief in God. They're holding sort of ambiguous beliefs as well, because it is not just that. But many of them will also say, like I've mentioned before, you don't get to tell atheists how to define atheism. But then they'll go on to tell other atheists that's not how the word is used. And think of somebody like Chris Mann, who argues, I have free speech, therefore I can define words however I want. But then when you say atheism is the belief God does not exist, he'll tell you that you're using the word wrong. So he holds a bunch of beliefs that are all inconsistent.
Yeah. Because only he, or at least he's committing a special pleading fallacy in the sense that he can define them how they want, but other people can't.
Exactly. But it's that holding of inconsistent beliefs that leads him to commit special pleading.
Yes.
If they were more coherent and more consistent, then he wouldn't make that fallacy, showing that good logic comes from good, consistent beliefs.
Yeah, that's fair. Manny's updated us as well. He said something about atheism not having to do with a proposition, but usually the threads get so out of control he can't really follow it. Yeah, I mean we've had a number of conversations with him about it, and he has in the past a couple of times understood how atheism can result to a proposition. So I think when we first actually posted the video to before we went live to if atheism is true, or is atheism true, and he actually responded to it can be if you relate atheism to a proposition, but he'll then get into other conversations and say atheism has nothing to do with a proposition. And even if it is only a lack of belief in gods, it's still a response to the proposition at least one God exists. So him saying that it has nothing to do with a proposition is ridiculous.
Yeah.
If he lacks belief in gods existing, okay, he's providing a psychological state and not fully answering a proposition, but he is still giving a half-assed answer to the proposition, at least one, in brackets, God exists.
Yeah.
But honestly, someone like Duke, I wouldn't really give them the time of day, because he's very, very, very much one of those people that just argues to have a fight and be right. He's an MMA fighter. And one of my favourite things about Duke, though, is he lists himself as a pseudo-intellectual. And he doesn't even realise... Yeah, quite proudly. He doesn't even realise it's a bad thing to be a pseudo-intellectual. So that will tell you enough. And when I brought that up with him as well, he still didn't see a problem with it. I actually addressed it directly. And he even said to me at one point, "What's your problem with skeptics?" And I said, "I don't have a problem with skeptics. I have a problem with denialists and pseudo-skeptics." He's like, "No, you have a problem with skeptics." And he went through, I mean, we've done a whole episode on skepticism and things like that. And it's like, there is more than just being a denialist as part of being a skeptic. It's not just saying, no, I don't believe you. No, I don't believe you. I doubt that you're right. I've got doubt. I've got doubt. There is more to skepticism than doubting and denying what someone says. But that's all he's got, because that seems to be all he's cognitively capable of.
Oh, yeah. He's one of those that I think adopts the term atheist because he thinks it says something over and above that lack of belief.
We see that quite often, don't we, really? There are plenty of people out there who are atheist because they feel that it makes them that smart, rational type person who's a good skeptic and knows what they're talking about, and almost wears it as a badge of honor rather than actually it being an answer to a proposition.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see that in the people that will go things like, I don't define atheism just as lack of belief. I define atheist as a person who is logical and rational and has logically and rationally assessed the evidence and seen that the evidence is illogical and irrational, and they use the same word over and over as if reinforcing to themselves, the other guys are irrational, but I'm super rational.
And how do you know that you are? Well, because I'm an atheist.
Because I'm an atheist, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this sort of highlights something that we were just discussing. Consider it in the form of an exchange such as this, and this is similar to the conversation you were having. Imagine two people having a discussion on the internet. one in the USA and one in the UK. The one in the USA asks the one in the UK, "What is the weather like outside?" And the one in the UK responds with, "How would I know? I don't live where you live. Just look out the window." The one in the UK has responded to the question in a way that does not really answer the question the one in the USA has asked. They have responded to it without the context that the question implies. The context implies that they were wondering what the weather was like outside where the person in the UK lives. The person in the UK has responded as if the person in the USA was asking the question locally. We would, generally speaking, know from what was asked, where it was asked, and why it was being asked, and who was asking it, that the context was an inquiry aimed at the person in the UK and not a localized question. If the person in the USA was asking a localized question, then they would have been more specific. We generally use various shortcuts in our language, shortcuts that are implied and understood by the one we're involved in a discussion with.
Yeah,
The
I mean
same can,
that's almost actually the opposite of the issue that I had earlier, where I was talking about the rain. I was saying it is raining outside, and they were going, "Well, it could be raining elsewhere." Like, yeah, but I'm talking about me right now, and
yeah,
they're asking the question. They're essentially going, "What is the weather like where you are?"
yeah,
But they're just deciding to ignore that and go, "Well, I don't know."
yeah, and they're intentionally ignoring the context because they have um not a plan, but something like that. They have an objective where they want to prove you wrong, so they will purposefully ignore the context of what's being said. And you can sort of see the same thing when a Christian will say, "God exists," and they say, "Well, which God are you talking about?"
And you can also understand why there is a problem that many theists have when they're talking about a particular verse being taken out of context as well. Because actually, some of the things, when they are taken out of context, read completely differently to how they are within the context. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that things like the Bible are perfect. They're far from it. They're full of errors and things like that. But there are some things that you can take out of context and make seem much worse than they are.
Well, sometimes the Christian will take something out of context to stop it sounding as bad as it looks.
That is equally true. Yeah. So basically, whether you're a theist or an atheist, you're going to be a dick if you take something out of context.
Yeah. Um, the same can be said of our expressions of beliefs. We expect that the person we are expressing the belief to will understand these shortcuts of language. However, these shortcuts can cause ambiguity, especially if the person we are in discussion with is not behaving with a principle of charity, does not understand the shortcuts, or has an agenda with the language that they use. Clarity of language can help overcome all of these problems and these kinds of ambiguity. If our goal is clear communication, and if during a discussion or argument our goal is understanding and progress, other goals may cause problems, of course. So the goal of winning the argument can cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
Now, returning back to our proposition of God exists, we can see further ambiguity coming in during discussions between atheists and theists. Consider the atheist that declares that they are not claiming that God does not exist when responding to a Christian or Muslim that is putting forward the proposition that God exists. In this context, they are essentially saying that they are not saying that the Christian or Muslim God is a false claim. However, often when the atheist says that they are not saying that God does not exist, they are not referring to the God of a specific theology. Indeed, most times when you push the lack theist for clarification, they will declare that they do not believe in any of the gods put forward by a religion, which generally includes the version of the God that the Christian or Muslim is speaking about when expressing the belief God exists. In essence, the lack theist is expressing a different belief to the Christian or Muslim. They are speaking at cross purposes.
Added to that, you'll often find the Lactheus making the statement that God or gods are imaginary at the same time. And so, I mean, if something is imaginary, it has no objective reality and therefore doesn't exist. So if you think something is imaginary, but you don't think it doesn't exist, you're sort of holding a contradictory belief there as well. And this is sort of one of your points about language, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah.
So uh, that, and generally they will say they think that the Christian or Muslim God is imaginary. Oh, but I'm not saying it doesn't exist. You are. You
You
just don't
are. Yeah.
realize you are for some reason.
I think they do. It's just that they're so entrenched in their positions and so entrenched in this idea that it's up to the Christian to prove, or the Muslim, or whoever is expressing the sentence, God, the proposition God exists. It's their burden. So therefore, they can say all these things, but so long as they finish it with, I'm not claiming that God doesn't exist, it relieves them of any burden of argumentation. But all it does is leave them with the burden of illogical and incoherent positions.
Yeah.
And contradictory beliefs, like you said. If you believe gods are imaginary, but you also believe that God could exist, you're holding contradictory positions. And the term cognitive dissonance is very popular in the atheist community. And cognitive dissonance is when you get angry because you hold specific sets of contradictory beliefs, and when pushed to express them, you get angry.
Yeah.
And we can see that happen a lot online with atheists who will say gods are imaginary. And then they'll say, the Christian or Muslim or whoever will say, oh, yeah, can you prove that? And then they'll go down the whole, it's not up to me. And they'll go on a bit of a rage quest because of the burden of proof type thing.
Yeah.
So all these contradictory beliefs lead them to get angry.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right there. It's quite amusing to watch. And I see goalposts shifting, and they're going, yeah, but I'm just talking about this particular thing. So I wouldn't say no gods exist. And as Leon says, a lot of people like to say theists believe in an imaginary deity, but will refrain from saying it doesn't exist. Except what they are saying by saying it's imaginary is them saying it doesn't exist. That's the whole point of something being imaginary. It doesn't have an objective reality. So yeah, it's if you're saying something imaginary, I mean that you're making a claim, and that's and I hate terms like magical sky daddy and things like that as well. Not only is it sort of condescending and patronizing, but if you say that and then you suddenly switch it and go, but I only lack belief, again, you're holding contradictory beliefs. Oh, Ozzy's just popped in the chat. How you doing, Ozzy? Nice to see you. Good to have you here. He says the same point can be made with respect to the expression God delusion. Belief in a God can't be a delusion unless a God doesn't exist. The same point can be made with respect to the. Oh, it said it twice for some reason. Yes, no, you're definitely right there, Ozzy. I mean, I think it's one of those things like when they say theism is a mental illness, or being religious is a mental illness. I think that's a terrible, terrible way to phrase things. Don't get me wrong. I can see people who are mentally ill having some fucking crazy beliefs, and I can see some of the beliefs some religious people might have being a bit crazy. But religion isn't necessarily, especially just a God belief, but religion in general isn't regarded as something that is a mental illness. And I hate the flip side when theists then turn it around and go, atheism is a mental illness. No, neither theism nor atheism are a mental illness. And everybody's got to stop attacking each other that way. There's a much better ground that you can have, and that ground is having a respectful discussion with each other and actually trying to find truth instead of just attacking each other and making out the other people are wrong, evil type creatures.
Yeah. Okay. Next paragraph. Oops, sorry. The same is true when the Christian or Muslim asks the atheist, "Why do you believe God does not exist?" Just as in the case of the person in the USA asking the person in the UK what the weather is like outside, context matters in this question too. The Christian or Muslim is not asking the atheist why they believe that the Christian or the Islamic God does not exist. When the atheist responds with, oh, that should be is asking. Sorry. When the atheist responds with, "I am not saying God does not exist," and they are speaking of a more generic version of God, or even the pantheist version of God, they are not responding to the question the Christian or Muslim is asking, or the belief that the Christian or Muslim is expressing. The atheist is responding to a different question and expressing a different belief, showing again the importance of understanding context and the importance of clarity in language to stop us talking and arguing at cross purposes. The referent in the question or expression of belief gives us the context of the question or the expression of belief. And if we ignore the referent, then we ignore the question or expression of belief. We are, in essence, discussing different sets of beliefs, making our conversation irrational and illogical.
Which I think from a number of examples that we've provided tonight, just that have come off the cuff, have shown that this actually happens quite regularly. Regularly,
Oh, get it from context.
Yes.
Sorry, you got Bruce Campbell on there. He has to be shown for a few minutes.
He does. I tell you what, though, one of my favourite roles of his was actually in Burn Notice. Have you watched that?
Brilliant, yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's very slapstick spy drama type thing, but I love it, and his character is just perfect.
Another good one that he's in that not many people have seen is The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr.
Never even heard of it. Never even heard of it.
And you call yourself a Bruce Campbell fan.
I never said that.
No, it's really good. It's like an action adventure set in the Bahamas, I think, in the late 1800s. And he's kind of like a spy, jack of all trades type character.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds hilarious. I'll have to have a look and see if I can find a copy of that to buy anywhere. Brilliant.
Nice one. Okay. All of this shows us why clarity in language is important and why well-defined reference, as well as making sure that we understand the context of the referent and the context of the belief or question, is important. The same is true of our own internal sets of beliefs. When we use sloppy language, we allow the chance for equivocation to come into our own internal sets of beliefs, and we express those beliefs sloppily. For example, if we are in a conversation with a Christian and we declare that their God is imaginary, but in the same conversation declare that we are not claiming that God does not exist or that there is no God, then we have committed a form of equivocation. The context of the referent may have changed for us, but the context of the cross-reference within the conversation has not. We have expressed two very different beliefs using the same word. We have made a cross-referencing error and caused ambiguity. The Christian will believe that we are still discussing their God, while in fact we are discussing a more generic God. We have expressed our arguments and our beliefs in a sloppy manner, and we have allowed bad logic and even perhaps bad reasoning to creep into our arguments. It is even possible to express a belief that sounds logical, But because of a badly defined referent, it turns out to be an illogical statement. Consider the statement, the keys are in the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter. If there is no fruit bowl on the kitchen counter, then we have put forward a statement with a referent that does not exist. We have essentially put forward a meaningless statement, even if in error, because we have referred to something that does not actually exist. The same could be true of any referent that is ill-defined or is simply an empty placeholder word waiting to be defined. If the referent is sloppy, ill-defined, or simply non-existent, then our statement is such too.
Yep, that basically covers everything that we've discussed up to this point anyway.
Yep. Okay, and in conclusion, language is important to beliefs and logic. We must be wary of our use of sloppy language when we are expressing beliefs and putting forward arguments to counter other beliefs and other arguments. An understanding of how context words and how reference and cross-referencing in statements works is a vital part of improving our own use of logic. Those that are concerned with how logical their beliefs are and how logical their arguments are would do well to pay attention to these things. We should pay attention to how we express our beliefs and how others express their own beliefs, and understand how important context is to the belief being expressed and the declarative statements being made. The referents are important. Who says them is important, why they are being said is important, and what is being said is important. We can easily use the same words to say very different things and use the same words to argue very different things, but actually simply be arguing in an illogical manner. And it's got Joe's article link there for his discussion about beliefs and logic too.
Bad atheist argument series. I think we should actually address the bad atheist arguments at some point.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
it's definitely something I do want to address. I might need to refine the article slightly, though. I think they're kind of sloppy. Although
As
that's
do I.
kind of my writing style.
Same. I mean, I've just spotted a few mistakes in there, so I should probably go back and fix them at some